welcome to the Inside Scoop. Today we're going to be interviewing Jeff and talk about teamwork and how teamwork works with an actual job. Because obviously, in school, not that much teamwork, and the teamwork there is not the best or most fun. So it would be kind of interesting to hear how it works on the job. So, is there anything you want to tell us before we get started? Like, I don't know, guess who you are?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Jeff Miller. I am an engineering leader here in Chicago. I come from a hands-on background, so I primarily did back-end development, but I have capability through the full stack. Like I was just telling everyone before we got on, I grew up in Iowa. I went to University of Wisconsin at Madison, and then moved to Chicago, where I got involved with the technology scene here. So it's a little bit about myself, and happy to answer any questions you guys have.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, just post them in the chat and we'll answer them, which we probably will have time to pick them in. I'll try to answer the ones in chat because obviously people want to know that. So the first question I have then is, when you start out with the team, what is the first thing you do as a leader and manager to set up the team with future success?
Yeah, so it's a great question. From my point of view, I focus on the people. So there's a lot of things you can focus on when you start a new job. I've started 2 new jobs during the pandemic, and so it's been interesting remote. But my focus is always first on the people. While I'm doing that, I want to demonstrate of competency, but you definitely don't want to look like you know it all, because they've had lived experiences that have gotten them to this point, both in the company and outside of the company. So you want to understand where they're coming from. You want to understand their perspective, what they want to achieve, both personally and professionally. And then after you kind of have a feeling of the team and the people, I really start to try to understand expectations of the team, the results that they're achieving, the current perception of the team. So I think this is one thing that especially engineers have challenges with, is that there's reality and truth, and then there's perception. But the fact of the matter is, perception is reality in a lot of cases. So if you've been on an underperforming team for a long time, you're going to be looked at as that underperforming team, and you kind of need to embrace that and change the narrative, as opposed to just hoping that that people will see you're doing well. So I try to understand that. I try to change as little as possible. So just kind of observe, understand why people do the things they're doing, and then focus on things outside the team. So what is it that people are expecting out of us? How does this team fit into everything else? Who's going to help us get to achieve our goals, all that kind of stuff.
That's interesting. Well, this is a little bit kind of weird question, but like, how many people are usually on a team? Because I've obviously never been on one, and it's kind of interesting to know.
Yeah, it's a great question. So it really depends on the company. I've tried to stick to teams that are full. I think of them as full stack, right? They are, in my mind, I try to staff them such that they are fully capable of achieving the goal that we ask of them. So that generally means on my team, a couple back-end engineers, 1 or 2 front-end engineers, and 1 or 2 test engineers. Sometimes we even go to like the level of having a DevOps person on the team. So the direct answer to your question is somewhere between 4 and probably 8, 9, 10, somewhere in that range. As you get to the higher end of that, it's starting to test the limits of the collaboration aspects.
Yeah, because that's interesting. Because obviously, it'd be kind of weird if you just did like, oh, I'm just the front end people, that's it, and then you kind of just have that. You kind of would have to rely on some other people not in your team. That's not as.
That is still how some companies operate. It's just not my philosophy.
Okay, that's interesting. I didn't really know that. So then, then this is another question about teams, and this is obviously pretty important. In your experience, what are the most common team pitfalls? So like, well, obviously, what makes you the most trouble usually?
Yeah. So I think the most general answer that I can give to that is the lack of ownership. So if the team doesn't own their work, doesn't own their results, doesn't feel accountable to what's being produced, it's going to be an underperforming team. It might be they're a team that just takes orders, takes direction. That's not what you're looking for out of a high performing team. They don't push back. So somebody says, go dig a ditch, and you don't ask why. You have a feeling of helplessness, like, oh, we could never get that done, or that'll take too long. All of those attributes of ownership are a key component to a high performing team. I think also just on the other end of it, the personal side of things, a lack of empathy or a lack of caring for one another is also very important. So if you ever detect like an us versus them mentality, whether the two parties are front end and back end, engineering and test, product development and engineering, the quote unquote the business and engineering, you just have to avoid those us versus them mentality. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you're all in the same company to achieve a result, and so we're all in this together, so to speak.
So it sounds like basically own your mistakes, or not mistakes, but own like what you've done. It's not just do the stuff, and also don't blame other people, or don't have the us versus them, which is kind of interesting because like I bet you could pretty easily get into it's this back end people making all these mistakes. It's just we just have to deal with it. I bet that's not very healthy.
It's a very tricky balance, right? Like the ownership aspect means you own your results and you take accountability for where you do well and for where you don't do well. And it is in somewhat conflict with that us versus them, but you have to have both of those things to be highly successful as a team.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, then this is the kind of a spin on that question. What is the most uncommon pitfalls? Are there any weird things that have happened? Like, oh, that's unexpected, but that is terrible for a team.
Yeah, it's a tough one to answer. Honestly, it's going to be, to me, from my experience, it's very different per team, per technology stack, per company. All of those type of things will make those uncommon pitfalls. But I think there are definitely aspects that can destroy a team. Right. And I think that was one thing you were interested in. And two of those things are, so the first one is almost the opposite of ownership. It's apathy. So if you just, someone calls on the team to do something and you're like, wait, what, who's there? You just don't care at all about the other people around or the results you're trying to achieve. And the other piece is like toxicity or selfishness or ego. Those things will definitely get in the way of a high performing team.
Okay, that's interesting because obviously, especially like toxicity and stuff. Obviously, I'm sure is not good at all. But we'll get to the next question: kind of what behavior can destroy your team? That kind of answers like toxicity, apathy, and that kind of stuff, right? That's probably the most.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, you definitely can have people that are driven by ego. That whether it is a coping mechanism or whether it is, they feel like they need to know it all. It doesn't help the team as a whole produce. And I think that's one of the things that is interesting about the working world is that like you can be the best high performer ever, but you're just never going to perform at the same level as my team of 65 engineers. Right. And so, like you have to have you have to have your ego in check, and you have to have like the spirit of learning, the spirit of teaching, and all of that kind of stuff, because like I said, you're just never going to be the sole solution.
You can't have like the one dude who's like, oh, you're the full stack, you do literally everything. Just that's not going to happen, which makes sense because obviously one person can't do that. Well, then you got an interesting question from the chat. What are the pitfall differences between remote teams and working in person? Are there any differences or any like, oh, this happens all online or anything like that?
Yeah. So I think, so in terms of team pitfalls, when you're remote versus in person, there's just a natural bonding that happens in person, whether it's that you can just tap someone on the shoulder, ask them a question. You can physically see that someone's contributing to the team by just like being in their same space. Some people are shy. Some people are different, right? Like different personalities. And so that manifests itself differently in a remote environment. So standard, like having shared expectations on when you should be on camera, when you shouldn't, when it's okay to be off camera, who should be contributing in what meetings, who shouldn't. And managers can help facilitate this and pull this out of people. But those are some differences in the physical environment versus remote. I think also pitfalls in the remote environment is that people can get stuck easier. So you're working on this problem, you just keep banging your head against the wall. Whereas in person, you may have a friend at work or somebody you can just be like, hey, even if they're non-technical and they don't know how to solve your problem, you're just venting to them and you're kind of like talking them through the experiences you're going through. And there's an analogy in the engineering field called the rubber ducky. And so basically, if you just explain your problem to this rubber duck that's on your desk, it can help you solve the problem because you've just articulated why you keep running into the problem. So it's the same thing in person at work. You run into somebody at the water cooler or the coffee machine or whatever, and you just, hey, I've been working on this thing for so long. Do you have any ideas? Or just talking it out will help. And so all of those serendipitous kind of relationships and conversations are much more difficult to manifest themselves in a remote environment. So so I'd say some of those are some of the pitfalls in a remote.
That's really interesting because you said that, because obviously for me, the Rubber Ducky thing is obviously, I find that was such, when I first learned about that, it's like, obviously it's such an interesting thing because it's totally true. Once you start talking to someone or just thinking about yourself, going through steps, you usually can really quickly find the answer. And you're right, if you're doing remote, obviously you can't just ask someone like, hey, what is it? Okay, well, I mean, explain it to you, or just something. It's not as easy. That's interesting. That's a good observation. Well, sorry, yeah.
There's also those natural breaks as well, right? So like in an office environment, someone will be like, hey, let's go grab a coffee, or everyone goes to lunch, or those type of things. And that doesn't always happen in a remote environment. And that also can lead to burnout, which is a different problem, but it also can lead you to just continue to just try, whereas stepping away and coming back to it might be the better solution.
Actually, if you want to talk about burnout some more, that might be nice, because I don't think we
Sure.
actually have that question. Like, what do you think burnout? Like, how would you? Is what's the best way to mitigate burnout, or help try to solve it?
Yeah, I think I have an interesting point of view on this. I'm not trying to be provocative in any way, but I do think as you start your career, you should throw yourself in. It doesn't mean you need to work like 120-hour weeks or anything like that, but you should throw yourself fully in while you have the ability to learn, to go build skills outside of the workplace, to like put in maybe a couple extra hours to get those results. Though that early investment will pay off in the end. Now, you don't want to burn yourself out to the point where you can't come to work, and obviously that's a negative outcome. But I would suggest that the work-life balance is a bit tipped toward work, especially in the early stages of your career, because it will need to balance out later in your life for other reasons, right? Familial or otherwise. And so I do recommend people dive in and get really heavy at the beginning and kind of balance it out in the long run. But avoiding burnout is in a remote environment does take a lot of effort and a lot of discipline. So I have a dedicated workspace. I'm fortunate for that. I agree. But anything you could do to make it turning on work in some form or fashion, whether that's a certain light desk lamp that you use if you're in your bedroom, right? Or if it's a certain chair that you sit in just when you're in work, just to get your mind, okay, I'm working now. And then when you change that environment, I am not working now. And that will help, I think, also self-reflection, either at the end of the day or at the end of the week, to just think about what activities you did that week that gave you energy, and what things at the end of the week that drained your energy inordinate with the amount of time you spent. So of course, if we all did the same thing for 40 hours, that would drain our energy. But like, if I only spent 1 hour of this, but it felt like 4 because I just hated what I was doing, just taking note of that and trying to figure out, is there a different way to do those things that drain my energy? And how can I do more of the things that give me that energy? Because to me, that helps recharge those batteries. And because burnout is not just about the amount of time worked. It's also about the cognitive load about your actual work and being able to turn on and turn off when it's the right time.
That's interesting, because I just read something. He said it's exactly what you said. If you need to have a workspace, and then you have a I'm not working space. Like the guy in the article, he said he would, one side of the table was for work, and if he was working, he'd be there, and he would just move to the other side and he'd say, I'm not working. At that point, no more work. It's done. So that's good. That's a good thing that you brought up.
Humans are interesting beings in our mind. We can play tricks on ourselves, but but we can also take those tricks and make them advantageous to us. And so they're tricks. I totally admit, but they help with these things.
That's interesting. But let's go to the next question. And it says, this is kind of more a broad one, but why do we need to work together anyways? If I'm writing code and Alex is writing code, why do we need to interact? Like, why can't one person do the full thing? It doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah. So I would say this is the biggest difference between school or a boot camp and the real world, is that if you're at all lucky, this software will live for a long time, and you will have to extend it and build on it. You will have to debug it because someone will push it to a limit that you weren't expecting. And a lot of other people, like, again, assuming you're in a company that is successful in the longer run, a lot of people will have to do all of those same activities. And so they won't be able to read your mind about like what you were thinking when you wrote that code. So so that's the biggest piece is maintainability, extensibility, like the ability to debug and find problems. The other piece is just having a shared understanding, and a part of that is mentoring, and part of that is growth, personal growth, and then personal mentoring. So, so you'll have to collaborate in ways to solve a problem. There are some companies that there is a requirement that multiple people be involved. So, in financial institutions or for other certifications, you actually can't have a developer who wrote the code push it to production. If anybody's seen Office Space, the tenth of a penny problem that they eventually accumulated money with, that's like the gist of what you would think of as the worst case scenario for those things. But there's compliance reasons why multiple people need to be involved, and then there's also just like you might write code one way and I might write it another. So the most simple way is if you think about this as object-oriented programming and procedural or functional programming. Let's say I come from a functional background and we write code in an object-oriented way. You'll want to review my code to make sure that it's in alignment with the styles and patterns of the overall code base, such that we can, again, all pick that piece up and know somewhat how it works. One of the things I tell my teams is simple is better than clever. So I've definitely seen blocks of code in a production environment that says, so-and-so wrote this, don't ever touch it because we don't know how it will work. And obviously that is not what you want out of a piece of software. I mean, the soft of software means we can continue to build it and evolve it, not that it's built. That's one of the reasons why I have a problem with it being called engineering. We're not building a bridge that is hopefully going to stand here for 100 years. We are always evolving the code base. And so when you build something that's simple, then anybody can pick it up, and it doesn't mean it's easy to build it in a simple way, but if you can build it in a simple way, it's going to be much more extensible and maintainable and understandable in the future.
That's a really good point, because I also want to say, because if anyone who's new to programming or just starting, that is very important, is to make sure clever solutions are really fun. But I have many a time late at night wrote my thing, think, oh man, I'm a genius, this is so smart. Next day I wake up and there's a bug. I look back and I'm like, what did I write? It looks like some insane person just wrote this. And I have to they usually just have to redo it. I have to just redo the whole thing because I don't remember what I did, because it's like in some like tricky good solution that doesn't actually is actually effective when I'm trying to fix any bugs. So that's
it reminds me of a story. The first time I was managing the whole team, the whole development team, we had an on-call person, and the nature of the software was at events. So things like music events or like auto shows, just big events for corporate sponsors. And the person on call got a call from a client that said, I just got an error message that said this should never happen. What do I do? And the on-call person they didn't know what to do. So they called me, and I had to figure out what to do. But that's an example of someone writing some code, and they pushed it out there. They thought this scenario should never happen, but obviously it did.
Yeah, that's another tip, is that everyone, if you write something that someone besides yourself is going to use, they will always figure out a way that you never thought of, and it will come in and they'll say, okay, this is obviously the way to do it. And you're like, are you insane? That's not the way to use it. And then they'll break your program, because basically cover all your bases. The edge cases are going to happen all the time. There's no, it's always, someone's always going to go wrong. It's kind of annoying.
Yeah.
Well then here, let's do this next one. The next one is, how do you know when your team has reached a state of real harmony? Is it a continual improvement process? And if so, what do you look out for to keep the ship on course?
Yeah. So if you want an academic perspective here, I would look at the forming, storming, norming, performing attributes of teams to study an academic study. I think authors Tuckman or something like that. But that would give you an academic answer to this. I would say anecdotally and observationally, what I look from for a team is you see the team's output being consistent and predictable. So if I don't know will the people on the call know what I mean when I say velocity?
Maybe.
No. Okay. So let me just describe that real quick and we'll talk about it. So as you're trying to predict what you're going to do in an agile environment, so we'll just use Scrum as a framework for right now. At the beginning of the planning, you might do estimation. You might not, but you might do estimation on tickets that says this is a small, medium, large, or you might give it a number like a 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, something like that. And so basically that gauges the size of the work in that ticket. And so at the end of the sprint, you just add up either all of those points to know what your velocity was for that sprint, or if you're not doing estimation, then you just count the number of tickets. So I got 10 things done this sprint. Okay. So some people really try to push for high throughput. So, we got, 5 this sprint. We'll work really hard and we get 20 the next sprint. Okay. The sprints are the same length of time. And they just continue to push. And that's fine. But what I find out of teams that are really working well is they understand themselves, they understand each other and their capabilities and their capacity. And that velocity and that capacity of the team becomes more consistent and becomes more predictable. So as a manager, I am not looking for someone to always try really hard to stay at 20 because I know it's not sustainable. And eventually they're going to have a 0 or a 5 and their chart is going to look like a mountain range. What I'm looking for is just a nice flat number because it helps us predict the future, right? Any estimation that we do is trying to guess the future. And so when we're asked for deadlines or when will this be done or all of that type of stuff, we don't want to predict it like hoping that Beck has a couple great 20 ticket sprints. We want to say, okay, we get 10 done on average. If we project that out, we're going to be done at this date. Maybe we pad it a little bit for unknowns and we have a much more predictable outcome. So that's one thing. Sometimes people think it's all about getting the most done at any given time. And for me, it's more about consistency and predictability. The other thing that a really good team will know is they will get their estimates will be more accurate. And so if you think something is a medium effort, it turns out to be a medium effort. You won't always be right because you're predicting the future and you're trying to predict all the unknowns. So you should try to get perfection out of your mind. But the more a team works together, the more they'll know the strengths and weaknesses of each other, the more they'll know the code base, the more they'll know a bunch of different things that lead to accurate estimates. And then that helps that line be consistent. I think the other piece of your question, though, is it is a continual improvement process. So if we have one project that goes swimmingly and then one project that doesn't go so swimmingly, or we can intercept a project in the middle and try to turn the ship around, so to speak, we should reflect back about what we can do better as a team, what we can do better individually. Maybe there's something that came up in someone's personal life and we can all have empathy for that. Not that you need to share everything that's going on, but I'm just saying we can continually try to get better on process it. So it might be hey, my dev environment was broken for half the sprint. Can someone just help me get it in a good place so I'm ready to go for the whole sprint, right? It could be something like a competing priority. So this happens in businesses from time to time where your team is supposed to be working on project A and somebody of importance comes and asks a specific individual to do something on project B, and that derails project A, and you the leader of the team or the team as a collective doesn't necessarily know that's happening. And so we need to continually evolve our processes and get better as individuals and as a team.
That's interesting because I didn't think about the consistency thing because I assumed you'd rather have someone, if they're on average they'll have 15, but then you'd rather have someone that says, okay, I'd rather have someone who gets 10 every single time than someone who gets 20 and then 25 because it's just a lot harder to predict what will happen because I assume that's the most important, which is actually I didn't really think about.
Yeah, so to be clear, that's a company cultural type of sentiment. So there are especially if you're at a startup and you are, you've raised a little amount of money and you have to get launched by a certain amount of time before you can raise more money, then it may be we're all going to that we're trying to all hit that 20 for 5 weeks in a row or 5 sprints in a row. But at a larger company, a little bit more mature, the value there might be more about predictability and more about quality and less about throughput, because you don't have some of those deadlines. So you will have to adapt a lot of some of this advice depending on the company culture. But from my point of view and from the places I've been, you actually probably will achieve more in the end by being consistent than with the spikiness. Because you can always try to go from 10 to 11, but trying to stay at 20 is just not going to be sustainable.
That's interesting, because in school, that's the problem with doing school, because you always kind of have to maintain that 4.0 and trying to get, or if you're trying to get a 4, it's just that getting that 4.0 is incredibly difficult, and it's honestly not, and to be honest, it's not the best way to learn material. Getting the 4.0 is like, yeah, that's great, but like you'll probably learn basically the same amount if you get 3.7 or 3.8. Like it's pretty much all the same, which is interesting, because obviously in real life you're just going for the most efficient thing, not the most not for the points or whatever.
Yeah, and a related aspect of that is in the work world, there is a lot of experimentation. So you as a team might try and experiment one sprint, either with a technical experiment that you're trying to say like, hey, if we take this divergent route, I know it's not on the main path that we're trying to get on, but it might get us there better or more, or it might be more performant at the end, or it might just be better in some way. And so you might take a risk that doesn't go toward your goal, and you might throw it away at the end, or you might say, wow, we found something great, and then just move the whole team over to that. So I would agree with you that it's not only the consistency and the spikiness, but it's also there's, everybody knows, the cliche of like fail fast and that type of stuff, but like, it's not all about failure. It's about trying things that are outside of what you do every day to see if it works. Right. And there's a lot of focus on failure is all I'm trying to say. And it's not about that. It's about trying things that will get us to a better place.
That's a good point. Well, that's a good thing, but we do have a question from the chat.
Yeah.
The question is, as we're interviewing and speaking with managers, what would be the what should we be looking for to determine if a team is a good fit? What question most interviewees should be asking about but aren't?
It's interesting. I would ask some questions like, what happens when priorities change? And just hear how they react to it. If they kind of stutter and stumble because things are changing all the time and they don't really know how to answer the question because it's constantly in flux, that might give you some insight. If they say something like, oh, well, the priorities don't change because we have a quarterly roadmap that we deliver once a quarter, and it's on a predictable pace. That gives you another perspective. That's not necessarily positive, right? Like somebody might want to be in an environment that I write code today, I put it in front of a client tomorrow, and I get feedback from them, right? So that it's a perfectly fine way of operating a business, but it might not jive with what your personal desires and goals are. So I think it's asking questions like that, just asking about their day-to-day, but don't ask a generic question about like, tell me about your day-to-day, because someone's going to just like paint the rosy picture. So try to think about the points of friction in the process and ask them very specifically about those points of friction. So another example might be like, what happens when two developers don't agree about a solution? How do you resolve it?
That's a good question, by the way, because you gotta have these. Because if you ask generic questions, they're either going to be prepared for them and just have the generic answer, or just not give the full picture. That's actually a really good point, because if you ask really specific questions that aren't actually, you're looking for an answer, you know what answer you want yourself, then it's obviously a lot easier to kind of tell. Because if you ask how's your day to day, you don't know what the right answer is. Like that's so generic. But you ask, you said any of those other things that are more specific, then you can actually get to the point and see what the actual performances of the team.
100%.
Okay, well, this is another little slightly different question. How important is mentoring for a team? Because at least for me, programming, especially my last computer science class I took, being able to talk to other students was really, really helpful and super important. And so I assume it's the same for teams, but I don't know. I'm kind of curious.
Yeah. So this is another one that will change company to company and culture to culture. But for me, it's really important. But the reality answer is it depends. So I've had engineering leaders that I've never reported to them because I don't share this philosophy, but I've had people say to me, well, it doesn't matter because I only hire senior engineers. And I could tell you plenty of stories where this group of 10 plus year experience type of people go off and work on something for a year and they never deliver. And so like, to me, that's not the focus. The focus is not on experience. It's around a lot of the concepts we're talking about today, which is delivering as a team, shared expectations, incremental progress toward the goal. I've just seen so many horror stories about just hiring senior engineers. And so to me, that means you have to be mentoring because you're bringing in people all the time at different skill levels. So you might have all junior people and you need to build the experience together. You might have people that are on different ends of the spectrum that can help bring the whole group along. So, I mean, mentoring is super important because of some of the things we talked about earlier, right? The influx of energy and ideas from people that either have no experience at the company or are just coming out of school or a boot camp. All of those things are really great for a team dynamic. And so like we have to bring everyone along. If the old cliche is you're only as strong as your weakest link, right? And tying into what we talked about earlier as well, which is, you don't truly know something until you teach it. And I didn't really figure that out until I volunteered to be a mentor in college. So I would mentor as a senior or junior, whenever I did this, mentoring entry level, like CS 101 type of students. And when somebody would ask me about how some basic thing worked, like maybe a where clause or something like that, if you can't explain it, you don't really know how it works. And so that's part of the mentoring process. I would throw management as being important here too. Sometimes engineers come into a company or just don't value what a manager does. And so your manager is there to help you along. I mean, if they're not there to help you along, you're probably at the wrong company. But a manager is there to connect you to the why. So when you're building something, you need to know why you're doing this because you're going to make a million decisions along the way. And so you have to know the why so you can make each of those little decisions toward the end goal. Another thing is just running interference. When I was talking to you about, the project A and somebody comes in about project B, if a manager's there holding things together, they can kind of take the request about project B and keep it in mind with the whole goal of the team. There's also just like mediation and acting as an escalation point. So, if two engineers are struggling to come up with the right solution, they have path 1 and path number 2. The manager's there to help adjudicate that. That doesn't mean they're going to make the decision. That means they're going to help guide toward the right path. So I just wanted to throw that in there as well, because I think it's both mentoring and management.
That's interesting because and also this is another thing for anyone who's watching. Please, if you actually, because when you said you don't really know it until you actually, if you can teach it, that is a very good point because especially for me, it's like I do this stuff and like I don't really know how to do it, and someone asks a question, and when I first started, I'm like, I don't want to answer other people's questions because I have to do my work. I have to get my stuff done before I can answer. But I always, after a while, when I try to start helping people more, like not as a mentor, but just like if someone asks a question, the child, just to try to help, it really helps when you help them, you're actually not helping them, you're helping yourself. Because after you help them, you'll get it so well. It's like just so easy after that. And you're helping them, but you're also pretty much helping yourself almost to the same degree. It's really important to try to help people when you can, because it really, really increases your understanding. Also, This is obviously not, if you have a deadline next day, don't help people. Finish your own deadline first, then you can help them. So, but keep in mind that it is helpful to help people out. That is important.
Definitely is.
Then that's this kind of related, but how can one be a good mentor to others? Because obviously, sometimes I feel like I'm trying to help someone, and I feel like I don't efficiently get my point across. I feel like I didn't help them, and I definitely didn't help myself. So, what are some tips to help mentor people?
Yeah. So I would start with just listening. So a lot of listening, a lot less talking until you understand exactly what's going on, right? It might be just like, in a work environment, let's just say it might be a little different in the school environment, but I would still think some of this applies in the sense that like the person might be coming to you just to vent, just to have someone to tell about their problem. And this is one of the things I've worked on over the course of the last couple of years, which is someone will come to me with a problem and I'll jump right to them, like right with the solution. So that's one of the kind of nice things about a remote environment is you can have little notes to yourself. So if I'm going into a particularly difficult meeting, I have this one up that says, don't jump into problem solving, because I don't know that they actually want me to help them with the solution. They might just want to talk to me about it. They just want me to help shape the direction. So I've gotten to be a better listener. I need to continue to get to be a better listener, but that's where I would start. I think the other thing is, from my perspective, and again, this could be different in the academic environment, is I try not to demonstrate my knowledge or to give them the answer necessarily. I try to share experiences. So they might be experiences that are related. Like I went through this one time and here's my scenario and here's how I solved it. And they might be completely unrelated. They might be like, somebody might ask me a question about solving an interpersonal conflict between two people on their team. And I might talk to them about me and my brothers and like how we resolve something, right? It just might be like totally different. And so, or like something I heard on a podcast or, just talking through the scenario. And so I would say those are probably my best tips on being a mentor.
That's interesting because if you listen, then obviously you also can understand if they don't you can get more of what they're doing. And you're saying that because I think some people do, they ask for help and they say, they obviously want help, but they want to kind of just talk to you, see how it goes. Because even if you just talk to someone, it's very important to just to see how other people think. I think the biggest example for me was it was in the last computer science class. It was a really hard one, and we're doing a project. And there was this one guy who never talked. He was never done computer science before. There was like it's really brand new. He didn't really say anything the whole time. And then at the very end, we were really having trouble with the problem. Like we didn't get it at all. He popped in. Remember, this guy had no program experience. He was not good. He popped in and he told us this perfect solution to figure it out. And I was just like amazed because this is the same guy who'd never really done anything else. And so I think it's very important to listen, and even if someone's not experienced as you, listen to them and make sure, because they're going to have good ideas too. It doesn't matter how experienced you are. It's more of like how you're thinking. So that's important. I think that kind of goes back to even if you're, even you can have these 10-year experienced developers kind of do something for a year and not get nothing done.
Yeah.
Just doesn't sound too fun to do that.
For the individuals or for the business.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's nice. But then, so the next question is that, how has remote work affected teamwork and communication? And we kind of did cover that a little bit. But I don't know. Do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I will say I think it's affected different people differently, as obvious as that might sound, right? For some people, it has been such a great blessing for them that we all had to go through this, global pandemic, and it changed the way people work. And for some people, obviously, it's a completely different story. And so it's really difficult to answer this in a blanket way. But I think some commonalities are that things I've heard is that there are fewer meetings, fewer interrupts, because the work we do does take deep focus and concentration. So not to diminish other disciplines, sales or accounting or those type of things. But in order to really solve some of these problems, you have to sit down for multiple hours uninterrupted. You can't take like a half-hour meeting here, have a half hour to work on something, sneak in another 30 minutes here. That doesn't work for the majority of developers. And so you need that uninterrupted time. And so that has been an advantage of remote work. The biggest negative I've seen is the loss of connection or loss of camaraderie. So there are a lot of studies that say you're much more likely to be happy at work and much more likely to stay at a job if you have a friend. And building those friendships in a remote environment is difficult. And it can feel stunted, or it can feel forced by like having these, I call them mandatory fun time, happy hours or, games or those type of things. But those are important, even though it can feel forced at times. So I think that's one of the benefits and one of the biggest drawbacks.
Yeah, and that is a good point because especially for me, because I really like being online, especially for schools. So I feel like it's way more effective. But I think other people it's really tough for them. It's not the same. Everyone's different. Some people really like this environment. Some people are just like, I want to be with people. I want to talk to them, and that's the best. And that's the best part. So it's also obviously dependent on the person, which is interesting.
100%.
We do have a question on the chat. They say, do you have different procedures for onboarding developers with no working experience yet? So what do you do if you get someone who's never done anything before? Do you do anything different? Someone who has?
Yeah. So I think I am much more rigid in the onboarding process than I am with more senior people. So when I am not a micromanager by nature, I am not going to, at the beginning of the week, we're not going to sit down and Jeff's going to give you 10 to-dos and you're going to go away and do them. And we'll talk about it on Friday, whether you got them done. I'm very much just, here's the destination we're trying to get to, trying to do everything I can to explain the why and all of that type of stuff. But when you're brand new, either to the like in your career or like the questioner asked, if coming directly out of school, that freedom and that lack of direction is daunting and scary. And I'm not trying to say that in a demeaning way. It's just like, you don't know what to do. What are the expectations? And so my solution there is we pair people up. We pair more senior people up too, but we really rely on those mentors or buddies to get people up to speed, to get people functional, to make them feel part of the group. There will be much more prescriptive tasks. So like by this time you should be able to do this thing. Or I would expect by the third week or fourth week, you would have contributed code and pushed up to create a pull request or a merge request, whatever Git system you're using. And so, so much more structured the earlier in the career you are.
That's good. Cause I especially for, taking classes, I hate the first couple of weeks because it's like I have no idea what the teacher's expectations are. I don't know what's going on, and so I do appreciate when teachers have very laid out. You need to have this done by this day, this done by this day, this done by this day. Because if they say, "Oh, well, the homework assignments are always due on Monday," it's like, well, I didn't know that, and so it's very nice if you just had it all laid out, no surprise things, just have it laid out for the first 3 weeks, and so I don't have to worry. So that does seem important.
But after you've been doing it 4, 5, 6, 7 years, like it's just pointless for me to try. First you set up your terminal and the person's like, I got all that. I understand how I like my stuff. Just give me a little time to get it all set up. So yeah, exactly. That's what I've experienced.
And so, and they're kind of talking about mentors again, but so you do sign up, you do try the mentorship. Obviously it's more important if you've got a new person, right? Like if you're a brand new developer, it's obviously more important to have one.
Yeah. What's important to me is having somebody for the person that's coming into the company to go to that's not in their reporting structure. So yes, you have a manager when you come into the team, but I don't want that person to be solely responsible for onboarding you because there's a built-in power dynamic there, right? And so like if you have a question about something or like, hey, how does this work? Or I actually have never used the terminal. I've had a bunch of different questions and like, you might be like, oh, if I go to my manager with that, they're going to take note and they may or may not. I hope they won't, but like it's just a built-in power dynamic. So for me, it's having somebody completely unrelated to that reporting structure that you can go to with those questions. And so when you ask like I said, how to clone the repo locally, it might seem complicated. Or it might not seem complicated, I should say, but you just can't get it to happen and you don't want to look dumb. And so just going to your buddy and being like, hey, I've tried this. Here's like the 3 things I tried. It's not working. Usually it works like this. How can I resolve it? And they're like, oh, you need to be connected to the VPN, something like that. And you're like, oh, okay. You connect to the VPN and boom, it works.
That is interesting. That sounds like a good idea. Well, we do have another question, and this seems very interesting. When interviewing new graduates, what sticks out to you as a good quality? What makes you say to yourself, I want this person on my team?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a base level of competence, right? So no one, interviewers or interviewees, no one likes the technical screen, right? It's it feels high pressure. It feels challenging, all that kind of stuff. So I'm just putting that out there, but I don't currently have a better way to understand a baseline competency. And that's all we're looking for. We're not like when we're hiring an entry-level person, shame on me if I'm trying to like hire you as a senior engineer. Like I know what we're getting into by hiring somebody that's coming directly out of a boot camp or directly out of college. So number one, our expectations should be right. But number two, what we look for beyond that base level is like a level of curiosity, a level of passion about something. It doesn't need to be about technology. So there's a question that I ask from time to time that's it's basically just like, Beck, tell me what your favorite hobby is and how I would get started. So people answer that question in a bunch of different ways, obviously. Some people think it needs to be tailored to technology. I try to dissuade them from that, honestly. So I had a guy talk to me about, he was really passionate about coffee. And so he just like, you could just tell when he started answering the question, his eyes lit up. He was just like, oh, let me tell you. And so then the question, I could ask further questions, well, where do you get the right beans? How do you know the beans are right? And he just had answer. And so that gives me enough confidence that they are going to be just as serious and just as curious about the work we do that he is about coffee. Well, we may never get to the coffee level, but at least he's got those skills to get there. And I should have been saying he or she the whole time, because I definitely think an inclusive environment is important. This example is specifically a male that I was interviewing, but anyway, that's one of the questions that we ask. I think during the technical interview, if entry-level people ask about the requirements, so I tend to write my own tech challenges. So I don't just like use the traverse a bee tree. Like, great, that's awesome. That's an academic question that we will never have to solve in our department. So I write my own questions generally, and I go through them myself. I send an engineer through it as well, so that we know what we're expecting of people. But that doesn't mean I get it perfect. So I had a typo in one of mine, and the fact that someone is like, I think this problem might not be right, was a great attribute for them, because they were digesting the problem. They were pushing back when it clearly wasn't right. I didn't do it intentionally, but like that is a great interaction. And if you just don't know where to start, just have a conversation with the person. Don't just sit there and kind of just think. It goes back to all these collaborative things we're talking about, right? So you might be, if you are just totally lost, you might just ask something direct, like, how would you get started? You might not think that that's like fair in an interview, and it might not work for you, but maybe that gets you going in the right direction, and then you can demonstrate your competency after that. But if you just sit there and think and never write a line of code, then you're lost anyway. So I would say curiosity, I would say passion, I would say the collaborative, anything you can do from this collaborative aspects that we've been talking about and demonstrate. Those are all the things we look for.
That's interesting. I think that the hobby one is pretty interesting, because I didn't even think of that, but that does seem like if someone's obviously really passionate about anything, obviously doesn't matter if it's tech, then they're going to at least bring some of that into the job, which is good. Well, this is kind of related, but I'm not sure you kind of maybe already answered this, but if you're an interviewer, what is the best question to ask? Would you find? I'm not sure if you've done that kind of stuff. Like, what kind of interview question do you find work out the best?
Yeah. So I've interviewed dozens of people, probably hundreds at this point. I think it goes back to, well, first off, it's totally role relevant, right? So I'm going to ask much different questions to somebody I'm hiring as a staff or principal engineer than I'm going to ask for an entry-level person. We've talked a lot about the entry-level side, but I will say I am constantly looking at interview questions like from the world, and constantly thinking about what we could change about the process. I do think it also goes back to the question earlier about what questions can we ask to know about the company culture. So I try to ask questions that are specific to pain points, right? So like if let's say somebody had a 6-month, they've been at a company for a while, then they had like a 6-month tenure at a company, and then they're hired, now they're interviewing at whatever role I'm in. Might be like, well, you just joined the company 6 months ago. What's gone wrong? So I won't leave it open to why are you making a change after 6 months or assuming the positive. In my opinion, something's gone wrong probably if they're leaving within 6 months. And so that's not always the case, right? They could tell me a story that they required people to come back after COVID back into an office and they didn't want to do that, or they required them to move. There could be a totally reasonable explanation, but I'm just going to ask the more direct, more difficult question. And if they respond to it in a positive way, great. So I think asking very specific things, asking things about experiences. So don't just like tell me how this should work in an ideal world. Tell me about a time when, but not always around that. Also just like, how would you approach this? And if it's very hand wavy, I like to think I'm still technical enough to say, well, how would you implement this or that type of thing?
That's interesting, because it does kind of make sense if you ask the same kind of questions as the interviewer as the interviewee. But this is another question: is what techniques have you used to facilitate teamwork and communication? I think we've kind of covered this stuff more, but like this is kind of like a wrap up for this one question.
Sure. So everything is built on the agile practices, in my opinion. So I am not a scholar of any of them in particular, Scrum or SAFe or any of these practices. To me, it kind of goes back to those agile principles, and some of them have dated to some extent, namely the in-person communication type of, I think it's agile principle number 5 or something like that. But basically, to facilitate teamwork and communication, it's updates early, speaking with each other often, small updates. Don't go away for 3 days and then tell us you have everything solved. So a daily update, an hourly update, but nothing mandated. Just whatever your team needs to keep the ball moving forward. And so I would say that's just keep agile principles in mind. And I don't say agile in any specific way, just the agility, the actual word. Keep those principles in mind, and small and frequent. I think from a leader perspective and also from an engineer perspective, I think transparency is super important. So my wife tells me I'm not a great liar, so it's easier to just tell the truth on everything. And so I would recommend that to everyone else. And so just be transparent, be vulnerable. Like when you're stuck, hopefully no one's going to judge you, and that to me is more endemic of the culture than it is on you, because these are roles that we need to take chances and get roadblocks out of the way. And some of those roadblocks might be, I don't know how to do this. And so just being transparent with your manager or your buddy or whoever it might be to try to get better teamwork and collaboration. And at the end of the day, I do think occasional in-person meetups help. I've tried to talk myself off of this for a while, but there's just something about meeting someone in person and have them be outside of this box here on the video that helps you connect with them as a person. It doesn't need to be every day. It doesn't need to be every week. It just needs to be at some point. And so we make a point to do that. I think a lot of other remote companies do the same. And so hopefully that in-person get together will sustain you till the next time. But I do think that's important.
That's some interesting stuff. I didn't really think about that, but that's good. That's some good answers. But then I think we have time for a couple more questions. Again, if anyone has any questions in the chat, just ask them and we'll try to cover them. But the last question I have written down here is what given what you've learned over the years, how would you approach school group projects differently? Because at least for me, and I think a lot of other people, group projects are like the worst thing. You don't like having to rely on other people is never fun, especially when you want to get something done really well. And how would you approach them differently now that you've had some more experience?
Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure, to be honest, because the incentives are different. So the incentive in a company is to achieve a long-term result and to build that team spirit and camaraderie. In my experience at schools, it was very much like you hit this milestone and then you're on to the next thing. And you basically never build on that first milestone. And so you're somewhat incentivized to just get to the result, get it as elegant as possible, and then kind of move on. The same thing with teams. So you might get into a group project to hit one of those milestones, and then you're probably going to break up and either form a new team or that type of stuff in the future. But like that's totally different than the business environment. I would say if there's anything I can point to that I didn't do well is I always wanted to, I had too much ego, to be honest. It was like, I either know how to solve this or I can figure it out and I don't need the other people. And I would totally change that now, right? I would change it to much more about learning, much more about getting other people's perspective, getting much more about, how would you solve this, or what are the things you're thinking about, right? Like maybe you don't know how to solve it, I don't know how to solve it. So what paths are you going down, so we can go down those paths together, and then just focusing on the outcome, not the specific assignment. So should we write tests to ensure that the code works, even though it doesn't ask for it? Is it the right thing to do? Then maybe we should do it.
That's good. Yeah, it is totally different. Obviously, doing homework is not the same. Getting it done is obviously the most important part.
Yeah.
If it's not perfect, getting it done, not long-term sustainability, because there is no long-term. But group projects are no fun. I'm glad it is different in actual work, because it's not fun at all in school. But
I mean, I'm sure I picked it up somewhere, but software development is a team sport, and I think a lot of some not evolved companies, in my opinion, and in some academic environments, it is much less of a team sport and much more individual, and I just don't believe that achieves the greatest result.
Yeah, you can't have one person do everything work. It just doesn't. You just can't. You said you can't have that one guy, even if they're a mega genius, they can't compete against 60 people. It's just not. It's not possible.
Yep.
Well, I think we're actually unless anyone else has any questions, I think we're mostly done. But is there anything else you want to talk about, or something we didn't cover that you want to talk about?
No, I mean, if you are intimidated or nervous about that first technical interview, don't be. Everyone is, and so I would just say, just go into it very open-minded and trying to learn from the company, and assume you're not going to get the first one. So basically, just go, like I said, go in with an open mind. I have done some talks like this about how to survive or how to thrive in a technical interview. Look for those type of resources, and I can send them to you after this. Not that my perspective is as important as just like hearing people that have gone through that process. As always, the first thing that people ask me about when it comes to interviewing is just like how to get through that technical interview.
Yeah. That's Renee said she usually just does interviews just to get some practice in, which I thought was interesting. Like, even if she's not looking for a job, getting that and continuing to get experience and like get used to that is important, which I didn't even think about. Like, I thought you just, okay, I want this job, I interviewed for this job. If you get in, that's great. But that's your goal. It sounds more of it's trying to get used to them, do as many as you can. That's the most important.
Yep. So then you can find the right fit. Back to the question about halfway through, right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, I think that's everything. So I think we got no more questions. And thank you so much for doing this with us. It's really interesting to see what someone with a real job, not just school, has to think about this. So Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. If anybody wants to reach out on LinkedIn, I'm there. I think Jeff Miller 00 is my LinkedIn handle. So happy to connect with anybody, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. You're awesome.